August 479 BC. The largest Persian army ever assembled stands ready for battle on the plains of Greece. 100,000 warriors from across the greatest empire the world has ever known. Leading them are the Immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers who have never tasted defeat, whose name alone makes enemies surrender without fighting. They wear scaled armor that glitters like dragon skin. They fight with a precision that seems superhuman. They are called Immortals because when one falls, another immediately takes his place, keeping their number eternally at 10,000. For 40 years, they have been unstoppable. But waiting across the battlefield is something they have never faced before. Not superior numbers. Not advanced weapons. Something simpler. Something that will turn their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. In the next few hours, the Immortals will discover that some walls cannot be broken. And 10,000 elite warriors will learn that immortality is just a name. If you want to see the untold stories that changed history forever, subscribe now and comment which ancient battle I should cover next. What happens in this fight will blow your mind. The Persian Empire in 479 BC was the superpower of the ancient world. It stretched from India to Egypt, from the shores of the Black Sea to the deserts of Arabia. 50 million people lived under Persian rule, half the world's population. When the great king Xerxes commanded something, nations obeyed. When his armies marched, cities surrendered. And at the heart of that military power were the Immortals. They were not called Immortals as propaganda or myth. The name was brutally practical. The unit always maintained exactly 10,000 soldiers. When one died, another immediately stepped in from the reserves, keeping the number constant. To enemies watching from city walls, it seemed the Immortals could never be reduced, never be defeated, never be killed. They were eternal. They were inevitable. They were death incarnate. The Immortals were recruited from across the empire, Persians, Medes, Elamites, but only the best. They trained from childhood in archery, javelin, horseback riding, and hand-to-hand combat. They wore distinctive uniforms, robes embroidered with gold thread, tall felt caps, and scaled armor that covered their torsos. They carried wicker shields covered in leather, short spears, bows with endless quivers of arrows, and curved swords for close combat. They were versatile, mobile, and lethal at any range. For 4 decades, the Immortals had been the spearhead of Persian expansion. They had conquered Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. They had crushed rebellions from India to Greece. They had never lost a major battle when fighting as a cohesive unit. Their reputation was so fearsome that many cities opened their gates rather than face them in combat. But in 490 BC, something unexpected happened. At the Battle of Marathon, a small Athenian army defeated a Persian invasion force. The Persians lost 6,400 men, while the Greeks lost only 192. It was shocking, embarrassing, and completely unacceptable to Persian pride. The great king Darius swore revenge, but he died before he could launch a new invasion. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the burning desire to punish Greece. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing the largest invasion force in ancient history. Ancient sources claim he assembled 1.7 million soldiers, an obvious exaggeration, but even conservative modern estimates suggest 200,000 to 300,000 troops. This army would dwarf anything the divided Greek city-states could field. Xerxes would not just defeat Greece. He would erase it from existence. In 480 BC, this massive force invaded Greece. The famous Battle of Thermopylae saw 300 Spartans and several thousand Greek allies make a heroic last stand in a narrow mountain pass. They held for 3 days before being outflanked and annihilated. The Persians then marched south, burned Athens to the ground, and seemed on the verge of total victory. But the Greek navy, in a stunning upset at the Battle of Salamis, destroyed much of the Persian fleet. Xerxes, suddenly vulnerable without naval support and facing approaching winter, made a crucial decision. He would return to Persia with most of his army, but leave behind a powerful force under his finest general, Mardonius, to complete the conquest of Greece in the spring. Mardonius commanded approximately 100,000 troops, still enormous by Greek standards. And crucially, he had the Immortals. 10,000 of the empire's finest warriors, veterans of countless campaigns, trained to perfection, equipped with the best weapons Persian gold could buy. Mardonius was confident. How could a fractured collection of Greek city-states defeat the concentrated might of Persia's elite? The Greeks, meanwhile, were terrified but determined. They had seen what happened to cities that surrendered: slavery, destruction, erasure from history. They had watched Athens burn. They had buried the 300 Spartans who died at Thermopylae. This wasn't just a war for territory. This was a war for survival, for freedom, for the very existence of Greek civilization. In August 479 BC, the two forces finally met on the plains near the city of Plataea in central Greece. 30,000 Greek hoplites faced Mardonius's 100,000 Persian warriors and their allies. The numerical advantage was overwhelming. The Persians had cavalry, which the Greeks mostly lacked. They had archers who could darken the sky with arrows. And they had the Immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers who had never been defeated in conventional battle. The Greeks had something different, something the Persians had encountered before but never truly understood, something that had won at Marathon and would be refined to deadly perfection at Plataea. They had the phalanx, and it would change warfare forever. The Greek phalanx was not just a military formation. It was a philosophy of warfare that reflected everything the Greek city-states believed about citizenship, courage, and collective strength. While Persian armies relied on individual elite warriors and missile weapons, the Greeks had developed something revolutionary, a system where ordinary citizens became an unstoppable wall of bronze and iron. A hoplite, the Greek heavy infantry soldier, was a citizen soldier, not a professional warrior. He bought his own equipment, trained in his spare time, and fought alongside his neighbors and relatives. His panoply, the complete set of armor and weapons, was expensive but essential. It consisted of a bronze helmet that covered most of his face, a bronze breastplate or linothorax, layered linen armor, bronze greaves protecting his shins, and most importantly, a large round shield called a hoplon or aspes. The hoplon was the key to everything. It was 3 feet in diameter, made of wood covered with a thin layer of bronze, and weighed about 15 pounds. It had 2 grips, one for the forearm and one for the hand. Crucially, it was designed to protect not just the bearer but the man to his left. Each hoplite's right side was protected by his neighbor's shield, creating an overlapping wall of bronze that was nearly impenetrable from the front. The offensive weapons were simple: a 7 to 9 foot spear with an iron tip and a short sword as backup. But the genius wasn't in the weapons themselves. It was in how they were used collectively. When Greek hoplites formed the phalanx, lines usually 8 men deep, they created something greater than the sum of their individual parts. They became a single organism, a moving fortress of shields and spears. The front rank would extend their spears forward, creating a deadly hedge of iron points. The ranks behind would hold their spears at different angles, ready to step forward if front rank men fell. The shields locked together, creating an unbroken wall. And then, at the command, the entire phalanx would advance as one, maintaining perfect formation, pushing forward with the combined weight of hundreds or thousands of men. This required incredible discipline and training. If the formation broke, if gaps appeared, if men panicked and ran, the phalanx became useless. But if it held, if every man trusted his neighbor to protect his exposed side, If the ranks maintained cohesion, if courage held against the terror of battle, the phalanx was nearly unstoppable against frontal assault. The Spartans had refined this system to perfection. Unlike other Greek city-states where men trained occasionally, Spartan males began military training at age 7 and continued until they were 60. They drilled constantly in phalanx formations. They learned to march in perfect step, to maintain spacing, to respond instantly to commands. They were not allowed to retreat unless ordered. They were taught that death was preferable to breaking formation. The famous Spartan saying, "Come back with your shield or on it," reflected this philosophy. To lose your shield meant you had run away. The shield was too heavy to carry in flight, so cowards dropped them. To come back on it meant to be carried home dead on your shield as a stretcher. Either victory or death. Never surrender. Never break formation. At Plataea, the Greek force included about 10,000 Spartans and their helot attendants, plus 20,000 from other city-states. The Spartans would form the right wing, the position of honor in Greek battle lines. They would face the elite Persian infantry, including the Immortals. It was a deliberate choice by the Greek commanders. The best of Greece against the best of Persia. The Persians, for their part, had encountered Greek phalanxes before at Marathon. But Mardonius believed he understood their weaknesses. The phalanx was slow and inflexible. It couldn't pursue fleeing enemies effectively. It was vulnerable to missile weapons, arrows and javelins that could strike from range. And it was helpless against cavalry, which could attack from the sides or rear. Mardonius's plan was elegant. Use his superior numbers and cavalry to harass the Greeks, disrupt their water supply, and prevent them from forming proper battle lines. Then, when the phalanx formations weakened from exhaustion and thirst, his Immortals would strike with overwhelming force. It was a sound strategy. Against any other enemy, it would have worked. But Mardonius had underestimated something crucial about the Greeks fighting at Plataea. They weren't fighting for conquest or glory. They were fighting for survival. And desperate men in perfect formation are the most dangerous warriors in the world. The Battle of Plataea didn't begin with a glorious charge. It began with 10 days of psychological warfare, skirmishing, and desperate maneuvering. Both armies camped within sight of each other, neither willing to attack across open ground where they would be at a disadvantage. The Persians controlled the plains, perfect for their cavalry. The Greeks held higher ground with better defensive positions. It was a stalemate, but time favored the Persians. Mardonius had the numbers and the supply lines. His cavalry could range across the countryside, bringing in food and water. The Greeks, compressed into a smaller area with 30,000 men plus thousands of support personnel, were consuming supplies faster than they could be replenished. Worse, the Persian cavalry had discovered the Greek water source, a spring called Gargaphia, and had fouled it with corpses and debris. Now the Greeks faced the prospect of fighting while desperately thirsty. The Persian harassment was relentless. Cavalry units would sweep toward Greek positions, unleashing volleys of arrows before retreating. They couldn't break the phalanx formations when the Greeks stood firm, but they could wound men, kill horses, and create constant pressure. One particularly aggressive Persian cavalry commander was killed by a javelin throw, causing temporary Persian demoralization, but overall the strategy was working. By the 9th day of the standoff, the Greek commanders faced a crisis. Their supplies were nearly exhausted. Their water source was compromised. Their position, while defensible, was becoming untenable. The Spartan king Pausanias, commanding the Greek forces, made a difficult decision. They would withdraw during the night to a new position with better access to water, regroup, and force the Persians to attack them on more favorable ground. It was a reasonable plan that immediately went wrong. Night movements with 30,000 men, many from different city-states with different commanders and languages, turned chaotic. Units became separated. Some commanders, either through miscommunication or deliberate disobedience, moved to different positions than ordered. By dawn on the 10th day, the Greek army was scattered across several miles, their formations broken, their unity shattered. Mardonius saw his opportunity. The Greeks were divided, disorganized, and vulnerable. This was the moment to strike. He ordered a general advance, with the Immortals leading the assault against the Spartan contingent, which had become isolated on a low ridge. Finally, after 10 days of waiting, the Persians would crush the Greek resistance. The Immortals advanced in their distinctive formation, looser and more flexible than the Greek phalanx. They were trained to fight both as a cohesive unit and as individual warriors. They carried their characteristic wicker shields, which were lighter than Greek bronze but adequate for deflecting arrows and blows. Their primary weapons at range were bows and javelins. For close combat, they had short spears and curved swords. Against most enemies, this versatility was devastating. The Immortals could shower opponents with arrows, close for melee combat, withdraw if pressed, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. They had used these tactics successfully for decades across 3 continents. There was no reason to believe today would be different. But the Spartans weren't most enemies. As the Immortals advanced across the plain toward the Spartan position, King Pausanias faced a terrible moment of decision. His forces were still forming up. The phalanx wasn't fully organized. Religious protocol demanded he wait for favorable omens from the sacrifices before giving the order to advance. But the Persians were coming, and waiting meant dying. The first Persian arrows began to fall. Spartans raised their shields, creating the classic defensive formation. Men fell wounded. The pressure mounted. Still Pausanias waited, sacrificing animal after animal, desperately seeking the divine approval that Spartan tradition required before battle. His men were dying around him, but he held to protocol with iron discipline. The Immortals came closer, their arrows falling in deadly sheets. Behind them, Mardonius commanded tens of thousands more Persian infantry. The entire weight of the Persian Empire was bearing down on fewer than 10,000 Spartans who weren't even in proper formation yet. It looked like a massacre in the making. Then something happened that changed everything. A contingent of Tegean hoplites, allied with Sparta, couldn't bear the waiting any longer. Without orders, they charged forward toward the Persians. It was a breach of protocol, a violation of command structure, and it was exactly what Pausanias needed. The Tegeans had technically attacked first. The omens were now irrelevant. Pausanias gave the order every Spartan had been trained from childhood to execute perfectly. Advance the phalanx. The Spartan phalanx began to move, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. 10,000 bronze shields locked together. 10,000 spears leveled forward. 10,000 men moving as one organism, advancing at a steady, measured pace toward the Persian lines. This was what they had trained for their entire lives. This was the moment when individual fear disappeared into collective purpose. The Immortals had faced many enemies, but they had never faced anything quite like this. The Greek phalanx advancing toward them looked less like men and more like a moving wall of bronze and iron. The front-rank shields were so tightly interlocked that individual soldiers were barely visible. The spear points protruding from the formation created a deadly hedge that made frontal approach suicidal. And the Spartans weren't running or charging wildly. They were advancing in perfect step, maintaining formation with mechanical precision. The Immortals responded with their standard tactics. They unleashed volley after volley of arrows. Thousands of projectiles arced through the air and crashed against the Greek shields. Some found gaps. Men cried out and fell. But the phalanx didn't stop. The second rank stepped forward to fill gaps instantly. The shields remained locked. The advance continued. The Persians switched to javelins, throwing them at close range. More Greeks fell. Still the phalanx advanced. The Immortals had never encountered an enemy that could absorb such punishment and keep coming. There was something inhuman about it, something terrifying in its mechanical inevitability. The Greeks weren't fighting as individuals. They were fighting as a machine, and machines don't feel fear. When the two formations finally crashed together, the true genius of the phalanx revealed itself. The Immortals' wicker shields, light and maneuverable, were perfect for individual combat. But against the massed weight of the Greek charge, they were inadequate. The Spartans in the front rank didn't just stab with their spears, they pushed forward with their shields, using the combined weight of the ranks behind them. The physics were simple and brutal. Each Spartan in the front rank had 7 men behind him, all pushing forward. The total weight was over a ton of pressure concentrated on a small front. The Persian front line, brave as they were, couldn't physically resist that mass. Their lighter shields crumpled. Their looser formation was crushed by the tight Greek cohesion. They were pushed backward whether they wanted to be or not. The Persian soldiers in the front ranks found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They couldn't retreat, their own men were behind them. They couldn't advance, the Greek shields were an immovable wall. They couldn't fight effectively, the Greek spears had longer reach than their short swords and spears. All they could do was die, impaled on bronze-tipped spears while being crushed by the inexorable forward pressure of the phalanx. The Immortals tried desperately to adapt. Some grabbed Greek spears, trying to break them or pull them aside. It rarely worked. The ashwood shafts were strong, and if one broke, the Spartan would simply draw his short sword and continue fighting from behind his shield. Others tried to get under the spears, hoping to close to sword range where Persian curved blades might be more effective. But getting close meant facing the shield bash, a blow from a 15-pound bronze shield delivered by a man with 7 others pushing behind him could break bones and knock men unconscious. What made it worse was the Spartan discipline. They didn't break formation to pursue individual enemies. They didn't get drawn into one-on-one duels. They maintained the phalanx and ground forward step by step, killing with mechanical efficiency. When a front-rank Spartan fell, the man behind stepped forward instantly. The shield wall never broke. The advance never stopped. General Mardonius, commanding the Persian forces, watched in growing horror as his elite Immortals were being systematically destroyed. These were warriors who had conquered half the known world. These were the soldiers who had never been defeated in conventional battle. And they were being crushed like insects against a wall of bronze. He made a desperate decision. He would personally lead a counterattack with his household cavalry and the best remaining Persian infantry. If the Immortals couldn't break the Spartan phalanx, perhaps sheer weight of numbers could. He ordered a general assault. Thousands of Persian warriors surged forward to support the failing Immortals. It was exactly the wrong decision. And it would cost Mardonius his life and Persia the battle. Mardonius rode a white horse at the head of his elite cavalry guard, leading the Persian counterattack personally. He was one of Xerxes's most trusted generals, a man who had commanded armies across the empire. He understood that battles were won by courage and leadership, by personal example that inspired men to fight beyond their limits. So he rode directly toward the Spartan phalanx, his bodyguard of 1,000 elite cavalry surrounding him, determined to break the Greek formation through sheer violent impact. It was a brave decision that revealed how fundamentally the Persians misunderstood what they were fighting. The phalanx wasn't held together by one man's courage or one commander's brilliance. It was held together by mutual dependence, by the knowledge that every soldier's survival depended on his neighbor holding position. Killing the Greek commander wouldn't break the formation. Every man in that formation was trained to continue fighting even if all their leaders died. The Persian cavalry charge hit the phalanx like a wave against a cliff. Horses, no matter how well trained, will not willingly run into a solid wall of spears. They shied away at the last moment, turning aside, creating chaos in their own ranks. Some riders managed to throw javelins into the Greek formation, killing or wounding men. But the phalanx held, and the casualties were immediately replaced from the ranks behind. Mardonius fought with desperate courage. He and his bodyguard managed to create a small pocket of chaos on the phalanx's flank, killing several Spartans in close combat. For a moment, it seemed like leadership and bravery might create a breakthrough. Then a Spartan from the second rank, a man whose name history would never record, thrust his spear forward and caught Mardonius in the torso. The Persian general fell from his white horse and was instantly surrounded by Spartans who finished him with ruthless efficiency. The death of Mardonius broke something in the Persian army's cohesion. When word spread that their commander had fallen, panic began to replace discipline. The Immortals, already being pushed backward by the Spartan advance, began to lose cohesion. The careful formations dissolved. Individual warriors started thinking about survival rather than victory. And then the rest of the Greek army arrived. The Athenians and other contingents, who had been delayed during the nighttime repositioning, finally reached the battlefield. Now the Persians faced not just the Spartan phalanx but multiple Greek formations attacking from different angles. The numerical advantage that Mardonius had counted on was evaporating. The Persian army began to retreat, slowly at first, then with increasing panic. The Immortals, who had never been defeated in conventional battle, were being routed. They fell back toward their fortified camp, a wooden palisade that Mardonius had constructed as a fallback position. Thousands of Persian warriors and their allies crowded through the gates, desperate for the safety of the walls. But fortifications designed to keep attackers out became a trap when the Greeks arrived. The phalanx, which struggled in open pursuit, was devastating in siege warfare. The Spartans and their allies surrounded the camp, then systematically broke through the wooden walls. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. Persian warriors trapped inside the camp had nowhere to retreat, nowhere to maneuver. The Greeks methodically killed them in what ancient sources described as the most one-sided slaughter of the entire war. The Battle of Plataea lasted perhaps 6 hours from the first clash to the final massacre in the Persian camp. When it was over, Greek casualties numbered around 1,500 men, tragic for their families but remarkably light for such a major battle. Persian casualties were catastrophic. Ancient sources claim 257,000 dead, which is certainly an exaggeration. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Persian and Allied troops were killed. More importantly, the elite Immortals, the supposedly invincible core of Persian military power, had been effectively annihilated as a fighting force. The survivors who escaped the battlefield brought news back to Xerxes that would end Persian dreams of conquering Greece forever. The great empire that had seemed unstoppable had been defeated decisively by a collection of Greek city-states using tactics and equipment that prioritized collective strength over individual prowess. The Bronze Wall had held. The Immortals had learned they could die. And the course of Western civilization had been permanently altered on a dusty plain in central Greece. But the true significance of Plataea went far beyond one battle. The immediate aftermath of Plataea was chaotic and brutal. Greek soldiers moved through the Persian camp, killing the wounded and gathering plunder. The wealth they found was staggering: gold, silver, fine cloths, Persian weapons, and armor decorated with precious metals. For citizen soldiers who were farmers and merchants in peacetime, it was a fortune beyond imagination. The Greek commanders had to impose strict order to prevent complete chaos as men fought over the spoils. But the strategic consequences were even more profound than the material gains. The Persian Empire, which had seemed on the verge of conquering all of Greece just 1 year earlier, was now forced into a complete withdrawal from Greek territory. The survivors of Plataea fled back to Asia Minor, abandoning their ambitions in Europe. The Greeks had won not just a battle but the entire war. On the same day as Plataea, according to Greek tradition, possibly more myth than fact, the Greek fleet won a decisive victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, destroying the remaining Persian naval forces. Whether or not the timing was truly simultaneous, the combined result was clear. Persian power in the Aegean was broken. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 2 generations, the Persian Empire had been the dominant military power in the known world. They had conquered Egypt, the oldest civilization on earth. They had crushed the Babylonian Empire. They had defeated every significant opponent they faced. The idea that they could be stopped seemed almost unthinkable. Plataea proved otherwise. A smaller force, using superior tactics and equipment designed for collective fighting rather than individual glory, had decisively defeated what was supposed to be an invincible army. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. The Persian way of war, emphasizing individual elite warriors, missile weapons, and cavalry, could be countered by disciplined heavy infantry fighting in formation. The Greeks understood immediately that they had witnessed something historically significant. They erected monuments at Plataea and Delphi celebrating the victory. The names of the fallen were inscribed on memorials that would last millennia. The battle became a touchstone of Greek identity, proof that free citizens fighting for their homeland could defeat the slaves and subjects of a despotic empire. But there was a darker side to this narrative that often gets overlooked. The Greek victory wasn't primarily about freedom versus tyranny, despite how later generations portrayed it. Many Greek city-states were oligarchies or tyrannies themselves. Sparta, which provided the crucial military leadership at Plataea, was one of the most rigidly hierarchical societies in the ancient world, built on the enslavement of the Helot population. What Plataea really proved was the effectiveness of a particular military system. The hoplite phalanx, when properly trained and equipped, was superior to other contemporary infantry formations in direct combat. This wasn't a moral victory, it was a tactical one. The Greeks won because their system of warfare was better suited to the terrain and conditions of Greece, not because they were morally superior or loved freedom more. The Immortals, despite their defeat, were still an elite fighting force. They had been defeated not because they were inferior warriors individually, but because they were using tactics designed for different enemies and different battlefields. In the open plains of Mesopotamia or the mountain passes of Afghanistan, Persian flexible formations and cavalry had devastating advantages. On the confined battlefields of Greece, against heavy infantry designed specifically to fight in close formation, those advantages disappeared. Xerxes and his successors learned from Plataea. Future Persian military operations relied more heavily on diplomacy, bribery, and supporting one Greek city-state against another. They never again attempted a full-scale invasion of mainland Greece. Instead, they played Greek factions against each other, funding whichever side served Persian interests. This strategy was far more effective than direct military confrontation. The Spartans, meanwhile, learned the wrong lesson from Plataea. They came to believe that their military system was unbeatable, that hoplite warfare was the ultimate form of combat. This arrogance would eventually contribute to their downfall when they faced enemies, like the Thebans at Leuctra in 371 BC, who figured out how to counter the phalanx. But in 479 BC, standing amid the bodies of the Immortals on the plain of Plataea, none of these future complications mattered. The Greeks had won. Western civilization would continue to develop independently rather than being absorbed into the Persian Empire. And everything that followed, democracy, philosophy, drama, The entire Greek cultural achievement became possible because of what happened on that dusty battlefield. The victory at Plataea transformed the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Mediterranean. Before the battle, Persia was the undisputed superpower, and Greek civilization seemed destined to be absorbed into the empire or crushed entirely. After Plataea, the balance of power shifted permanently. Greece would not only survive but would enter a golden age of cultural achievement that would influence human civilization for millennia. Athens, in particular, benefited enormously from the Persian Wars. The city had been burned by Xerxes, but its people had survived by evacuating to nearby islands. With the Persian threat eliminated, Athenians returned and rebuilt their city. More importantly, they used the momentum of victory to establish the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states ostensibly formed to protect against future Persian attacks, but in reality dominated by Athens. The Delian League's treasury, nominally shared among all members, was gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. Athens used the naval forces of the League to enforce its will across the Aegean. The city became immensely wealthy, and that wealth funded the extraordinary cultural flowering of the 5th century BC, the age of Pericles. The Parthenon was built with League funds. The great playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote their masterpieces. Philosophy flourished with Socrates teaching in the Agora. None of this would have been possible if the Immortals had won at Plataea. If the Persian army had crushed the Greek resistance, Athens would have remained a burned ruin or been rebuilt as a Persian subject city. Greek culture would have been absorbed into the Persian system. The philosophical and democratic traditions that would later influence Rome, the Renaissance, and modern Western civilization would never have developed. But Plataea also exposed deep divisions within Greek civilization that would eventually prove destructive. Sparta and Athens had fought side by side against Persia, but they were fundamentally different societies with incompatible values. Sparta was militaristic, oligarchic, and conservative. Athens was commercial, increasingly democratic, and innovative. The tension between these two models of Greek society would eventually explode into the Peloponnesian War, a devastating conflict that would consume Greece for a generation. The irony was profound. The Greeks had united to defeat Persia, proving that their way of war, the citizen soldier fighting in disciplined formation, could defeat the armies of despotism. But they couldn't maintain that unity in peacetime. The hoplite phalanx that had saved Greece at Plataea would be turned against other Greeks in the fratricidal wars that followed. The military lessons of Plataea spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The effectiveness of heavy infantry in close formation became the dominant paradigm of warfare for the next 2 centuries. City-states across Greece invested heavily in training hoplites and maintaining phalanx formations. The basic tactical principles developed at Plataea, discipline, cohesion, the importance of holding formation regardless of casualties, became fundamental to Greek military thinking. But the phalanx also had inherent limitations that would eventually be exploited. It was slow and inflexible. It struggled on rough terrain. It was vulnerable to being outflanked by faster, more mobile forces. It required extensive training and discipline that not all societies could provide. And it was helpless against genuinely innovative tactics, as the Thebans would later prove at Leuctra by concentrating overwhelming force on one section of the phalanx and breaking through. The Persian Empire, meanwhile, remained a major power despite its defeat in Greece. Xerxes returned to Persia and continued ruling an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. The loss of Greece was embarrassing but not catastrophic. Persia still controlled vastly more territory and population than all the Greek city-states combined. And Persian gold could do through bribery what Persian armies had failed to do through force: influence and manipulate Greek politics. For the next 150 years, Persia and Greece would engage in a complex dance of diplomacy, bribery, and occasional military confrontation. The Persians funded whichever Greek city-state opposed Athenian dominance. They supported Sparta against Athens in the Peloponnesian War. They played Greek factions against each other with ruthless effectiveness. In many ways, this strategy was far more successful than Xerxes's attempted conquest had been. The Immortals themselves were reconstituted after Plataea. The unit's name and prestige were too valuable to abandon. New recruits were trained, new equipment issued, and within a generation, 10,000 elite Persian soldiers once again guarded the great king and led his armies. But they never again faced Greek hoplites in major battle. The lesson of Plataea had been learned. Some fights aren't worth repeating. The long-term influence of Plataea extended far beyond ancient Greece. The battle became a touchstone for Western military thought, studied and analyzed by commanders for over 2 millennia. The basic principle it demonstrated, that disciplined infantry in tight formation could defeat more numerous or individually superior opponents, remained relevant through the Roman legions, medieval pike formations, and even into the gunpowder age. The Romans, who conquered Greece 3 centuries after Plataea, were deeply influenced by Greek military thinking. While they developed their own innovations, the manipular legion was more flexible than the rigid phalanx. The core principle remained the same: disciplined infantry fighting in coordinated formation. Roman writers explicitly referenced Plataea as an example of how proper organization and training could overcome numerical disadvantage. The battle also became central to how Western civilization understood itself. Greek and later Roman writers portrayed Plataea as a clash between freedom and despotism, between the citizen soldier defending his homeland and the slave soldier fighting for a tyrant's ambition. This narrative, only partly accurate, as we've discussed, became foundational to Western political thought. The idea that free citizens make better soldiers than subjects of tyranny influenced everything from the militias of medieval Italian city-states to the American Revolution. The reality was more complicated than the myth, but the myth was powerful enough to shape history in its own right. When Renaissance Europeans rediscovered classical texts, they found in Plataea a model for how a smaller but more disciplined force could defeat a larger empire. This influenced military thinking during the early modern period, when European powers were developing professional standing armies. The specific tactical lessons of Plataea took centuries to become obsolete. The principle of infantry fighting in close formation remained dominant in warfare until firearms fundamentally changed battlefield dynamics in the 16th and 17th centuries. And even then, the basic concept that coordinated action by disciplined troops is superior to individual heroics remained central to military doctrine. Modern military historians debate endlessly about what Plataea really proved. Some argue it demonstrated the superiority of Western military organization, the disciplined citizen soldier versus the subject fighting for a distant emperor. Others contend it was simply a matter of tactical matchup. The phalanx happened to be perfectly suited to Greek terrain and the specific challenges posed by Persian forces. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The Greeks at Plataea had several distinct advantages: better heavy infantry equipment, superior training in formation fighting, more motivation, defending their homeland versus conquering foreign territory, and leadership that understood how to leverage these strengths. The Persians had their own advantages: numbers, cavalry, missile weapons, but the specific conditions of the battle negated most of them. What's undeniable is the battle's historical impact. If Plataea had gone differently, if the Immortals had broken the Spartan phalanx and Mardonius had won the day, the entire trajectory of Western civilization would have changed. There might have been no Athenian Golden Age, no classical Greek philosophy as we know it, no democratic experiments that would later influence modern political thought. Persian culture was sophisticated and advanced in many ways. Their administrative systems, their tolerance of diverse cultures within the empire, their architectural and artistic achievements were all impressive. But it was a fundamentally different civilization from what developed in Greece. A Persian victory at Plataea would have meant Greek culture developing under Persian dominance, creating a hybrid civilization that would have been neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something entirely different. The bronze wall that held at Plataea didn't just save Greek independence. It preserved the space for a distinct Western civilization to develop, one that would eventually spread across the Mediterranean through Roman conquest, influence medieval Europe through preserved classical texts, and shape the modern world through the Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning. All of that, the entire arc of Western history, depended on 10,000 Spartans holding formation while arrows fell like rain and the Immortals charged toward them. It depended on discipline overcoming fear, on training overcoming individual courage, on the collective strength of the phalanx proving superior to the individual prowess of elite warriors. The Immortals were exceptional soldiers. They deserved their fearsome reputation. They had conquered much of the known world. But at Plataea, they encountered something they couldn't overcome, a military system specifically designed to counter everything they did well. And in that encounter, the fate of civilization turned. The individual stories from Plataea, recorded by the ancient historian Herodotus, reveal the human reality behind the grand strategic narratives. These weren't abstract forces colliding. They were men, terrified and brave, fighting and dying for reasons they understood or didn't, leaving widows and orphans or returning home as heroes. Herodotus recorded the name of Aristodemus, a Spartan who had survived Thermopylae by being absent from the final battle due to an eye infection. He returned to Sparta in disgrace, shunned as a coward who had failed to die with his king. At Plataea, Aristodemus fought with suicidal bravery, breaking formation to charge alone into the Persian lines, seeking an honorable death to redeem his reputation. He got his wish. He was killed in the fighting. But the Spartans, valuing discipline over individual heroics, refused to honor him as the bravest warrior of the battle. That honor went to Posidonius, who had held his position in the phalanx and fought with courage without breaking formation. The story reveals the fundamental Spartan military philosophy. Individual glory meant nothing compared to collective discipline. The man who broke formation, even to perform heroic deeds, was less valuable than the man who held his position and trusted the system. This attitude, almost inhuman in its subordination of individual to collective, was precisely what made the phalanx so effective. Every man knew that his survival depended on his neighbor's holding position, so every man held position regardless of individual fear or courage. Another story involved Sophanes of Athens, who fought with an iron anchor attached to his belt by a bronze chain. Before battle, he would drive the anchor into the ground, literally anchoring himself to his position to ensure he couldn't retreat. It was a dramatic gesture, the kind of individual flourish that Athenian culture celebrated even while maintaining the discipline necessary for phalanx warfare. The Athenians, unlike the Spartans, allowed for personal glory within the context of collective fighting. The Persian side had its own stories of courage and tragedy. Artabazus, one of Mardonius's senior commanders, had argued against giving battle at Plataea. He wanted to withdraw to Persian-controlled territory, use their superior resources to bribe Greek city-states into betrayal, and divide the Greek alliance politically rather than defeat it militarily. When Mardonius rejected this advice and ordered the attack, Artabazus positioned his 40,000 troops at the rear of the Persian formation. When the battle turned against Persia, he was able to retreat with his force largely intact, eventually leading them back to Asia Minor. His pragmatic survival ensured that the Persian defeat, while catastrophic, wasn't quite the complete annihilation it might have been. The aftermath of the battle was brutal for the Persian survivors. Greek forces pursued fleeing Persians for miles, cutting down men who had thrown away their weapons to run faster. Ancient warfare showed little mercy to defeated enemies, and Plataea was no exception. The Greek victory monuments were decorated with captured Persian armor and weapons, physical evidence of the defeat that would stand for centuries. The Greeks also found in the Persian camp a stark demonstration of the cultural divide between the two civilizations. Mardonius's personal tent was filled with luxury, golden furniture, fine carpets, dining vessels of precious metals. The contrast with the austere Spartan lifestyle was so dramatic that Pausanias, the Spartan king commanding the Greek forces, ordered a demonstration. He had the Persian chefs prepare a meal using Mardonius's provisions and serving ware, then had Spartan cooks prepare a typical Spartan meal of black broth and barley bread. Displaying the two meals side by side, he laughed at the absurdity. "See how foolish the Persians are. They have such abundance, yet they came to rob us of our poverty." It was good propaganda, but it obscured a reality that would become clear in subsequent decades. Persian luxury came from controlling a vast, wealthy empire. Spartan austerity came from controlling a small territory and a large enslaved Helot population. Neither system was morally superior to the other. They were just different adaptations to different circumstances. But in the immediate aftermath of Plataea, with Greek victory fresh and Persian defeat obvious, such nuances were easily ignored. The men who fought at Plataea went home to their farms and workshops, their injuries and memories, their glory and their trauma. The phalanx had held. The Immortals had fallen. And the world had changed in ways that few of them fully understood. But historians would understand. And they would study this battle for millennia to come. The military analysis of Plataea continued to evolve over centuries as warfare changed and new generations of commanders studied the battle with fresh perspectives. What seemed like straightforward lessons in the immediate aftermath became more complex the more deeply scholars examined the engagement. The most obvious lesson, that heavy infantry in tight formation could defeat more numerous light infantry and cavalry, was true but incomplete. The phalanx worked at Plataea because of specific conditions that wouldn't always be present in other battles. The terrain was relatively flat and open, allowing the Greeks to maintain formation. The Persians made tactical errors, particularly Mardonius's decision to commit his forces piecemeal rather than using his numerical superiority to envelope the Greek flanks. And critically, the Greeks had high morale and were fighting for survival, while many of the Persian forces were subject peoples with less commitment to the cause. Later battles would show the phalanx's limitations. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Theban commander Epaminondas defeated a Spartan phalanx by massing overwhelming force on one section of the line and breaking through with a concentrated push. At the Battle of Kyrenia in 338 BC, Philip II of Macedon used combined arms tactics, coordinating phalanx infantry with cavalry and light troops, to defeat the Greek city-states. And when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire with his Macedonian phalanx, he was using a significantly modified version with longer spears, the sarissa, and more flexible unit organization. The evolution of the phalanx from its Plataea form to the Macedonian version demonstrated an important principle. Military systems must adapt or become obsolete. The Greeks who fought at Plataea had developed a system perfectly suited to fighting other Greeks and, as it turned out, Persian-style armies. But when faced with new challenges and new enemies, the system had to evolve. The Immortals, meanwhile, underwent their own evolution. After Plataea, Persian military doctrine shifted. Later Persian armies relied more heavily on Greek mercenary hoplites, essentially adopting the enemy's successful tactics. By the time Alexander invaded Persia in 334 BC, the Persian army included thousands of Greek mercenaries fighting in phalanx formation, a direct acknowledgement that the Plataea model had proven superior for certain types of warfare. But the Persians also recognized that no single military system dominates all situations. In the rough terrain of mountain warfare or in the open expanses of Central Asia, cavalry and light infantry retained significant advantages. The lesson wasn't that the phalanx was universally superior. It was that different tactical systems were effective in different contexts. Modern military analysis of Plataea focuses on several key factors that determined the outcome. First, the Greeks had a clear defensive objective: prevent Persian conquest of Greece, while the Persians had a more ambiguous offensive goal: punish Greece for earlier resistance. Defensive operations often enjoy morale advantages. Soldiers fighting for their homes fight harder than soldiers fighting for distant territory. Second, the Greeks had interior lines of communication and supply, while the Persians were operating at the end of long supply lines stretching back to Asia Minor. This gave the Greeks strategic flexibility and made Persian logistics increasingly difficult as the campaign dragged on. Third, the specific matchup of the Spartan phalanx against the Persian Immortals favored Greek equipment and tactics. The heavy bronze armor of the Greeks protected against Persian arrows and light spears. The longer Greek spears outreached Persian weapons in close combat. The tight formation of the phalanx concentrated force in a way that the looser Persian formation couldn't match. These advantages were decisive in the specific context of Plataea, but wouldn't necessarily apply in all situations. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the Greeks had spent months preparing for this specific battle. They knew the terrain. They had chosen their position carefully. They had time to train and coordinate. The Persians, meanwhile, were operating in hostile territory with an army composed of diverse peoples who didn't always coordinate well together. None of this diminishes the Greek achievement at Plataea. They won a decisive victory against a larger force under difficult circumstances. But understanding the specific factors that contributed to victory provides a more nuanced picture than the simple narrative of Greek superiority that ancient sources promoted. The truth is that Plataea was won not by some inherent Greek advantage, but by specific tactical, strategic, and circumstantial factors that the Greeks successfully exploited. The Bronze Wall held not because it was invincible, but because it was the right tool for the specific challenge it faced. And that, ultimately, is the deepest lesson of Plataea. Success in warfare comes not from having the best system in an absolute sense, but from matching your tactical approach to the specific circumstances you face. The cultural impact of Plataea on Greek civilization was profound and lasting. The battle became a foundational myth, a reference point for Greek identity that would persist for centuries. When Greeks wanted to illustrate courage, discipline, and the triumph of civilization over barbarism, they pointed to Plataea. The battle was commemorated in artwork, poetry, and public monuments throughout the Greek world. The Oath of Plataea, allegedly sworn by Greek soldiers before the battle, became a sacred text of sorts. The oath committed the Greeks to fighting until victory or death, to burying the fallen properly, to never rebuilding destroyed temples as monuments to Persian sacrilege, and to holding annual memorial ceremonies. Whether the oath was actually sworn at Plataea or was a later invention is debated by historians, but its symbolic importance was immense. It represented Greek unity against foreign invasion and commitment to shared values. The destroyed temples that the oath mentioned were particularly significant. When the Persians burned Athens in 480 BC, they destroyed temples and sacred sites. The Greeks left some of these ruins standing deliberately, as reminders of Persian barbarity and Greek suffering. The Parthenon, built decades later, was partly financed by the desire to create something magnificent enough to replace what had been destroyed and to demonstrate that Greek civilization had not just survived but flourished. The veterans of Plataea became living legends. In Athens, they were given front-row seats at theatrical performances and other public events. Their opinions on military matters carried special weight. They were living proof that ordinary citizens, when properly organized and motivated, could defeat the armies of empires. This fed directly into Athenian democratic ideology, the idea that the same citizens who voted in the assembly could also fight effectively in the phalanx reinforced the connection between political participation and military service. Sparta used Plataea differently. For the Spartans, the battle confirmed what they already believed: that their rigorous military training and austere lifestyle produced the finest soldiers in Greece. The fact that Spartan discipline had held firm when other Greeks might have broken reinforced Spartan confidence in their system. This would have both positive and negative consequences. It made Sparta militarily formidable for generations, but it also made Spartans rigid and unable to adapt when facing new challenges. The battle also influenced Greek philosophy. The demonstration that disciplined collective action could defeat superior numbers fed into philosophical discussions about the nature of virtue, the relationship between individual and community, and the sources of political power. Plato and Aristotle, writing generations later, both referenced the Persian Wars when discussing ideal forms of government and the military foundations of political systems. For the Persians, Plataea was a defeat that required explanation and rationalization. Persian sources, which survive only in fragments and second-hand accounts, apparently blamed the Greek victory on treachery, unfavorable omens, and the failings of individual commanders rather than acknowledging any systemic military advantage. This wasn't unusual. Defeated powers rarely admit that their enemies fought better or had superior systems. But it meant the Persians learned incomplete lessons from Plataea, which would contribute to their later defeats at the hands of Alexander. The broader cultural narrative that emerged from Plataea, the idea of the West defending civilization against the East, would echo through history with troubling consequences. The Greeks portrayed the conflict as freedom versus slavery, civilization versus barbarism, reason versus despotism. This oversimplification ignored the complexity of both societies and created a template for understanding East-West conflicts that persists even today. The reality was more nuanced. Persian civilization was sophisticated, tolerant in some ways that Greek societies weren't, and administratively advanced. Greek society included slavery, imperial ambitions, and political violence. Neither side had a monopoly on virtue or vice. But the Greek narrative won because the Greeks won the wars and wrote the histories. Modern historians try to provide more balanced accounts, recognizing achievements and failures on both sides. But the power of the Plataea narrative, small democratic society defeats vast empire through courage and discipline, remains compelling even when we know it's simplified. The story taps into something universal about underdog victories and the triumph of organization over raw power. And at its core, stripped of nationalist mythology and cultural bias, there is something genuinely remarkable about what happened on that dusty plain in 479 BC. Citizen soldiers, fighting for their homes, held formation and defeated professional warriors from the most powerful empire in the world. That achievement, however we frame it, changed history. The legacy of Plataea extends far beyond ancient warfare into fundamental questions about military organization, citizen soldiers versus professionals, and the relationship between political systems and military effectiveness. These questions remain relevant today, 25 centuries after the Bronze Wall held against the Immortals. The concept of the citizen soldier, the idea that ordinary people can be trained to fight effectively rather than relying on professional warriors, was proven at Plataea and would influence military thinking for millennia. The American founders, for instance, were deeply influenced by classical examples like Plataea when they debated whether the new United States should rely on militias or standing armies. The Second Amendment's reference to a well-regulated militia reflects this Greek-influenced belief that armed citizens are the foundation of a free society. Modern professional militaries have obviously moved far beyond the phalanx, but the basic principle that Plataea demonstrated remains relevant. Properly trained and organized infantry, fighting with discipline and cohesion, can defeat seemingly superior forces. This concept influenced the development of professional armies in early modern Europe, where drill and discipline gradually replaced individual martial prowess as the foundation of military effectiveness. The specific tactical lessons of Plataea became obsolete centuries ago. No modern military fights in phalanx formation. But the underlying principles, concentration of force, maintenance of formation under stress, coordination between units, the importance of morale and training, remain fundamental to military doctrine. The Spartans at Plataea demonstrated that discipline could overcome fear, that training could overcome individual disadvantage, and that system could triumph over improvisation. The cultural legacy is more problematic. The narrative of Plataea as West versus East, or freedom versus tyranny, has been used to justify everything from European colonialism to modern military interventions. The idea that Western military systems are inherently superior to Eastern ones, that Western values are universal, that conflicts between civilizations are inevitable. All these troubling concepts can trace their lineage back to how the Greeks framed their victory over the Persians. Modern scholarship tries to complicate these narratives, to show that the reality was messier and more interesting than the simple mythology. The Persians weren't barbarian hordes. They were a sophisticated civilization with remarkable achievements. The Greeks weren't democratic heroes. Many were slaveholders and imperialists. The conflict wasn't about freedom versus tyranny. It was about power, territory, and incompatible imperial ambitions. Yet even with these qualifications, something significant happened at Plataea. A military system based on collective discipline defeated a system based on individual elite warriors. A society that, for all its flaws, had elements of political participation defeated an empire ruled by absolute monarchy. These facts don't make the Greeks morally superior, but they do suggest that different forms of political and military organization have different strengths and weaknesses. The question that Plataea ultimately raises is whether there are connections between political systems and military effectiveness. Does a society where citizens participate in governance produce better soldiers than an empire of subjects? The evidence is mixed. Sparta, the most militarily effective Greek city-state, was hardly democratic. Rome conquered the Mediterranean with armies that became increasingly professional and less citizen-based over time. Modern democracies have won many wars but have also lost some. Perhaps the real lesson is more subtle, that different military systems work in different contexts, that no single approach is universally superior, and that victory depends on matching your tactics and organization to the specific challenges you face. The Greeks at Plataea succeeded not because they had the best military system in any absolute sense, but because they had developed a system perfectly suited to the specific enemy and terrain they faced. The bronze wall that held at Plataea wasn't invincible. It was simply effective in that moment, in that place, against that opponent. When Greek phalanxes later faced Macedonian combined arms tactics or Roman flexible legion formations, they lost. The phalanx evolved or was replaced by better systems. Military history is a story of constant adaptation, of systems rising and falling as conditions change. But for one crucial battle in 479 BC, the phalanx was exactly what was needed. 10,000 Spartans stood in formation while arrows fell and the Immortals charged. They held. The bronze wall did not break. And because it held, Western civilization as we know it had the space to develop and flourish. The Immortals discovered they could die. The Greeks discovered they could win. And history turned on the courage of ordinary men standing in extraordinary formation, refusing to break, refusing to run, holding the line until victory was won. The secret weapon that annihilated the Persian Immortals wasn't secret at all. It was visible to anyone watching, bronze shields locked together, spears leveled forward, and the unbreakable will of free men defending their homeland. That weapon changed the world. And its legacy echoes still.